Good afternoon and welcome to God's Answers to Your Questions, the Wednesday afternoon edition. If you are coming in on Facebook, please submit your questions or comments to us there. You can comment by my page, CJ Marshall, or the God's Answers page, or Christian Edification Ministries, uh, or Digital Bible Study, and YouTube channels, my YouTube, Digital Bible Studies, or the Christian Edification Ministries YouTube. But if you have questions or comments, use all those channels provided. Joining me today, I'm gonna be careful what I say to him today, but little plug. Simon Harris.
Hey, CJ. Yeah, we better watch our tongues today, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So why don't I start us off with a word of prayer since
Great idea.
you're gonna be a host. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day. Thank you for loving us, watching over us, and keeping us safe day by day. We love you, Father. We ask all these things through Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
So, Simon, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about James chapter 3, which has a big section, verses 1 to 12, talking about taming our tongue. But before we started, you and I were talking that really, if you look at this whole chapter as a unit, so often we think of James 3 as just being about the tongue. But the second part of James 13 to 18 is about being wise. And so if you put this idea together, I really think that what James is talking to us about in chapter 3 is about how to be wise teachers. And I really see it as building off of what he has said in chapters 1 and 2. So in chapters 1 and 2, he talked about not being hearers of the word only, but doers of the word. And then he talked about the necessity of faith and works in chapter 2. And so here in chapter 3, it almost looks to me like he's showing us how to put those things into practice and how to be wise teachers, I think is really what he's going to get at. Again, that's not to take away anything from what he says about us controlling our tongues, because we certainly need to control our tongues, whether we're teaching or not. But that he's going to point it out that that's especially going to be true if we are going to be teachers. So,
Simon, does this mean that I shouldn't say that. I gotta watch my tongue today. Anyway.
all right. Well, that you're being wise then.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll start us by let's just look at what he says in verses 1 and 2. So I'll read verses 1 and 2, and we'll make a few comments about those two verses. I'll be reading from the New King James. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. So, CJ, I have a question for you. James here tells us that not many of us should become teachers. But in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12, the Hebrew writer there rebukes the Christians that he's writing to, that they should be teachers by now,
Right.
but they're not. So do James and Hebrews contradict one another?
No, I think James is what James is gonna get at. Uh, uh, James gets at here is keyed in by the next phrase. Not many of you should become teachers because teachers are under stricter judgment. And so James doesn't say nobody should teach, but you have to watch what you teach. Then in Hebrews, they were ready to teach, and but they were not willing to teach. That uh, that uh, they were supposed to be ready to teach, but they weren't. Here he says, okay, if you are a teacher, what does that uh, uh, acquire
Yeah.
you to do? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Exactly. So are there any false motives a person could have for wanting to be a teacher?
Sure, self glory, or there's even promoting an agenda, or in fact, in Philippians 1, Paul talks about how some are proclaiming Christ out of false motives, but the gospel is being preached anyway. So, sure,
Yeah.
not, not everybody is sincere.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly the idea. And as a matter of fact, I made that comments in the introduction that 13 to 18 seems to be connected to that. Well, if you just drop down real quickly and look at verse 14, when he's talking about uh,
Mm.
earthly wisdom, he says, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts. So, sometimes we envy the attention that teachers get. And this was common among the Jewish people. You remember even Jesus in Matthew 23, he says, don't let anybody call you father because you have one father. Don't let anyone call you rabbi because you have one rabbi. And so really what he's talking about there is this desire to be a teacher for the prestige, or like you said, maybe to promote an agenda. And in many cases, the agenda is me, right? I want everybody to think I'm cool, and so that's really what he's getting at. And though this isn't in the text, but here's kind of how I like to think about it. I shouldn't want to be a teacher with a capital T. I should want to be a teacher with a lowercase t. So I should see being a teacher as a service, and not as this position where everybody thinks I'm cool. And he comes along and he says, listen, the reason for this is because you are going to receive a stricter judgment. When you start teaching things, especially, and I think this is what's under consideration here, when you start teaching things that are related to God and salvation, you better be careful, because now you have a grave responsibility. You are representing God. You are telling people things that can and should draw them closer to God, should eventually lead them to the grace of God that brings salvation to man. And so you better be careful in that teaching. And so that he says, don't become a teacher just to become a teacher, but if you're going to become a teacher, know that you are going to receive a stricter judgment. And the reason we need to be on guard for that is because all of us say dumb things from time to time. And that's what he gets at in chapter 2. We all say things, we all stumble in what we say at time from time to time. Let me give you a really silly illustration of this. But I hate to admit this, but it's actually happened to me more than once. At least two times when I was performing a wedding ceremony for a young man and woman. I actually said to the husband, I called him by name. This isn't his name, but I just make up a name. I said, Chuck, God wants you to be a good wife to Valerie. So, I mean, that was a dumb little thing.
Um,
And I didn't even realize this, but another time I prayed that Nick would be a good wife to Carla. And that is their name.
did you get punched in that instance?
No, but everybody laughed. Everybody laughed. And again, there have been other times where maybe I've quoted a verse and I've given it the wrong passage. And so that kind of thing happens. And so you just have to be careful. And again, I'll tell you, the way to avoid a lot of that is just to be as prepared as possible. And so what he's telling us is that as a teacher, we have to be skilled in the use of our tongue. And you just think, but doesn't that make sense? I mean, if you were going to be a soldier 200 years ago, you need to be really skilled with the sword, right? And we can even take this in the realm of being a let's say today that you want to be a tailor, a seamstress, then you have to be really skilled with scissors and needle and thread, right? And so whatever job you're going to do, you have to be skilled in the use of the tool. And so for a teacher, the primary tool that the teacher is going to use is his or her tongue. And so he says, so you need to learn to control your tongue. And he even goes on to say that if you know how to control your tongue, in verse 2, what does he say that you really are?
You are a perfect man.
Yeah, a perfect man. So you're a complete man. So when we demonstrate as a teacher the ability to control our tongue, then at the same time, we're showing people that we have a controlled life. And so now our example should back up what we're teaching. And so this all comes down to James saying us learning to control our tongues. If we can control our tongues, we can control our whole body. And so then what James is going to do in the next section is show us how that is true. So do you have any other questions or observations about 1 and 2?
Well, just that sometimes we associate a church with a teacher. Like, I'm gonna go to Albany, New York. That's where you live, right? I don't want to get it wrong. Albany, New York, because I'm gonna go to Simon's church, because Simon preaches there. Well, one, I don't think that's exactly right. But if two, if people are associating preachers with churches, this is especially true. We better watch what we say. Have you ever heard people do that from time to time?
I have, yeah.
So we better watch what we say, and really, uh, I'm guilty of that. I go, well, who preaches there? Why don't you come to my church? Who do you preach to again? Oh, okay. Now we'll come.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Not the right reason, right? It should be that the Lord is being taught there.
right.
Yeah. All right, let's move into this next section and talk about the power of the tongue. You want to read? Want to read 3 to 8?
Sure. If we put bits in the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we got their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire! And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, reptile, and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison.
All right. So what James does, again, it's interesting. There's a play on words, right? In verse 2, he says that he is a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body. And then he turns right around and talk about a horse being controlled by a bit in its mouth. And so you see that play on words about bridling a horse. And so here he's talking about bridling our body. But you know what the comparison that he's really making in all of these illustrations with the bit in the horse's mouth, the rudder on the ship, and even the forest fire, is that here is a little bitty thing that ends up controlling or changing a big thing. You know, you just think about how big a horse is. I don't know what a horse weighs. You know what, 1,000 pounds maybe. But then you just think about a horse, the bit in that horse's mouth. You know,
Right.
here's a pin. You know, the bit isn't much bigger than this pin, and yet that 1,000-pound animal can be controlled by a bit in its mouth. And then he talks about a rudder. I remember one time, it's been a long, long time ago, but I actually looked this up. I looked up, you know, how big an aircraft carrier is, and then thinking about how small the rudder is on that ship. And what's really cool about the illustration of the ship that he mentions, so look at verse 4. He says, "Look at the ship. Though they are so large and driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires." I think that's a cool illustration. I mean, you just think about the power of the wind and what the wind can do. I mean, you know, winds have been known to blow buildings down, right?
Especially,
Huh?
especially bad wolves.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking about that, but you're right. And then, so here you've got this wind blowing on this big ship, and it, you know, without that rudder, that ship is just going to go wherever the wind blows it. But when you have somebody driving that ship who is skilled, they can make that ship go wherever they want it to go, regardless of how the wind is blowing. And I mean, to me, that's one of the really amazing things about sailing. You know, I'm not a sailor, don't know anything about sailing, but that's the point that he's trying to make. So, you know, you can have the wind trying to blow the boat that way, and yet when the pilot of the ship is skilled, he can make it go wherever he wants to. with that little bitty rudder. And so that's the point that he's trying to get across there, that just as the ship can be driven wherever the pilot wants it to go with that little bitty rudder, well, guess what? With our little tongue can take our body wherever it wants to take us, wherever, what's ever controlling that. It can take us wherever it wants to go. It can even take us places we don't want to go when we allow it to be the thing that's controlling. And that's really the point of that illustration. So if we are going to, if we want to be the perfect man, if we want to be a wise teacher, if we want to be pleasing to God, then we have to make sure that we are controlling our tongue. And then just think about this when he talks about the forest fire. When I was a little kid, Smokey the Bear was always on commercials, and he would always talk about, be careful about your campfire. He would tell people not to throw cigarette butts out into the forest, because one little cigarette butt thrown out into the forest can make thousands of acres of that forest burn to the ground. So look at the influence, look at the damage one little spark, one little cigarette can do. Can words do that?
Yes.
Yeah.
But they can destroy relationships, destroy marriages, get people kicked out of jobs, even. And we don't think that this thing, and I won't stick out my tongue, but just a small little. Is that me?
That's me. I'm sorry.
Okay. Just a small little member can cause so much trouble. And so his point will be we have to control it. We have to watch what we say and what we think, and really, I think about in this conversation, Matthew 15, where Jesus says there, it's not what comes out of them, it's not what comes into the man that defiles the man, but what comes out, because what comes out proceeds from the heart. So my language should will dictate what my heart is. So if I'm constantly tearing others down and, well, I don't know, cursing God, what does that say about my heart? We sing a song, Is Thy Heart Right with God? It just always comes back to the heart.
That's right. And like the thing is, like with that spark that starts the forest fire, you just never know how far that forest fire can go. And if we want to put this back into the context of being a wise teacher, think about how scary it is to know that if I teach error and that then leads somebody else astray, who knows how far that error can go. There are some false doctrines that are prevalent in the world today that actually carry a man's name. You think about Calvinism. So there was a man named John Calvin, and he taught a doctrine that I believe, according to the scriptures, is false. And now there's a doctrine that it carries his name, and millions of people believe that doctrine and are going astray because of that. How horrible that would be to know that you didn't use your tongue well and you said something that was wrong that started a fire that actually ends in eternal fire. And maybe that's even why he says the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. And then at the end of verse 6, he says, it is set on fire by hell. And so I think he's really trying to get us to appreciate just how dangerous an untamed tongue can be. So then he moves in the verses 7 and 8. It looks like, y'all, that we've lost CJ, and I guess he'll be back soon. If not, we'll just carry on, and we'll teach this. And I appreciate y'all hanging out with me. In 7 and 8, he says that every kind of beast has been tamed. I mean, again, we just think about the horse. We can tame a horse with that little bit. He says, but no man can tame the tongue. So that means the tongue is more ferocious than a wild animal. I don't like snakes, but I think about the snake charmers that I've seen on TV. And to think that they can charm that snake, but the tongue cannot be tamed. And so the tongue is more ferocious than a wild animal. It's more dangerous than a venomous snake. And so man can't tame his tongue alone. And I'm going to tell you that again, this doesn't mean that the tongue cannot be tamed. It means that if the tongue is going to be tamed, we have to look beyond ourselves. And that's what comes in this next section when he's going to talk about wisdom that is from above. So if we're going to tame our tongue, we're going to have to follow God's guidance in doing that, which also ties us back to chapter 1, where he talked about not being a hearer of the word only, but being a doer of the word as well. So we can't do this on our own. We need help from God.
Right.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Did you see my message?
I did, but we won't talk about that on live.
well, I didn't want to leave you wondering. So,
yeah. So I did see it, but not at first. So, but we're cool.
So verse 7 kind of scares people because it says, for every kind of beast and bird and reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed, but no man can tame the tongue. So is James here giving us an excuse to just lie and gossip and swear because no man can tame it? Did you already answer that question?
Yeah, I did, but we can still talk about it again. So what I said was that we can't do it on our own. What we need is that wisdom that James is going to talk to us about in verses 13 to 18. That's right. That we can't tame it, so we have to look outside of ourselves in order to be able to tame it, and so we have to look at what God has told us to do.
And it's cool to me. There's also an emphasis in this section on what we want to do. Like it's the wherever the pilot directs it. And so we can't say, well, God made me say that, or I really didn't mean it, but I can't control it. It's not in me. That's just my fleshly side. None of that. It's what's in our heart, as we've been saying. I made the point earlier. So we can't blame God. We can't blame our background we have no one to blame except for me, except for you. And so that's helpful to see. Hey,
Absolutely.
George.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. So if I can't do it by myself, I've got to look for help.
Right?
Okay, so the next thing, so he talks about this idea, in these verses, he talks about how the power that the tongue has. And then when we move into verses 9 through 12, the point is how inconsistent the tongue is. And so I will read those verses. It says, talking about our tongue, with it, we bless our God and Father, and with it, we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives? Or a grapevine bear figs? Thus, no spring yields both salt and fresh. So James is making an observation that we know to be true in our own life, and that is that when we control our tongue, we have this ability to curse people and turn right around and bless people with the same mouth. Let me tell you a quick story that kind of illustrates this. A couple years ago, I was in the parking lot of a shopping center, and my battery had died. And so I'm really sitting there waiting for somebody to come out who might be able to help give me a jump. Well, out walks this lady and 3 kids. And man, she is literally cussing at her kids. She is talking mean and ugly to her kids. And I mean, it was kind of scary. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, man, I'm not asking that lady to give me a jump because she might cuss at me. And then, so lo and behold, she gets all of her kids in the car, and then she kind of takes a couple steps towards me, and as sweet as can be, she says, "Hey, do you need a jump?" And I was like, who is this woman? This woman just been cussing at her kids and saying all these ugly things, and now she's going to turn around and talk all sweet to me like that. And it just really struck me that she was illustrating this point. And we understand that everything else that God created doesn't work that way, right? Would you ever go to a fig tree looking for olives? Would you
No,
ever go to a grapevine looking for figs? No,
no,
that's not the way God designed the world. So when God breathed the breath of life into us, he did not intend for us then to turn around and breathe out cursings and blessings. He says this is not the way it's supposed to be. So if I'm trying to be a wise teacher, if I'm trying to be a perfect man, if I'm trying to be uh, a godly person, then what comes out of my mouth needs to be godly all the time. Go ahead.
So keeping this in context with the good teacher, how hard is it maybe when you're teaching to say you say you're preaching and then somebody were to jump up and say, "Hey, I have a question," right in the middle of your uh, sermon? What would you say? Would you ignore him? Would you lash out at him? Would you say, "Not now, sit down"? Uh, and think about that and what that would do to people. That
Yeah.
would lose all credibility that rest of that sermon. you would not reach a single person for the rest of the sermon if you did that.
Yeah,
So,
you know, that might be true. Yeah, it might be true. I tell you another thing that I think about along those lines, and I see we got a comment from George that where he says, and he's right, our speech reveals what is in our hearts, and you know that's exactly right. And so again, if I'm trying to be a teacher of God's word, what's coming out of my mouth? And so here's where I think this kind of connects. You know, a lot of what John Calvin wrote was true, but he said some things that weren't true that leads people astray. And so it's not enough for me to make sure most what I say is true. It's not that I should make sure that most of what I say is a blessing. And it's okay if some of it is not. No, that's not it. To be a perfect man, everything that comes out of my mouth needs to be a blessing. So when I'm teaching, it all has to be true. And again, that goes back to that idea of being a perfect man. You know, what I teach, what I preach has to be perfectly in line with God's word. And if it's not, I have become a curse to those who hear me.
right? And so I don't know if you're ready to move on to 13 or not, but 13 is really going to connect this whole passage to chapter 2 in one way.
Absolutely. I am, unless you have something else about the inconsistency of our tongues in 9 to 12, I'm ready to move.
You know, don't be hypocritical is another way to put it. There is a connection quickly with Matthew 7. Jesus teaches, judge not, for you be judged. But he continues and says, why do you look at the beam which is in your brother's eye? And, well, I can't talk today, Simon. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but don't consider this beam in your own eye? You know, we can do the same thing when we're teaching. If we're telling if we preach on this text and then turn around and say something uh, totally off par or teach something untrue or even say something ugly, we just have fit the description of somebody who's looking at the speck beam in the brother's eye and not seeing our own faults. And so what right do we have then to turn around and teach people what we did was just wrong? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, we've got to be consistent. All right, let's look at this wisdom from above. Why don't you read 13 to 18?
Sure. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct let him show his works in meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. But where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
All right. So, I'd like, instead of like just looking at this verse by verse, I want to think about some ideas that James gives us. Um, Again, he has said we need to be careful as a teacher. He says we need to learn to control our tongue. He says that we can't control the tongue by ourselves and that we need to be consistent. And so now I think one of the first things that he says to us, to help us learn to be wise teachers and to control our tongues, is to go to the right source for wisdom. So in 13, 15, and 17, he talks about different sources for wisdom. So there's our wisdom, which isn't good. There's earthly wisdom, that's not good. And then there's wisdom from heaven. That's what's good. That's what's going to make us perfect. That's what's going to get us into this position to be wise teachers. And again, too often we rely on our own wisdom. We even have a kind of a dumb phrase in our country that says, if you want something done right, do it yourself. Well, okay, there are times where I get that, but in this chapter, that doesn't work, right?
Right.
Because James has made it clear, and we know in our own lives that we're not good at controlling our tongues. So I can't look to me. So I have to look at something else. And so I need to seek that wisdom that is from above. By the way, James has already told us in this book how to get that wisdom. James chapter 1 and verse 5, he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, right? So you have that. We have to pray for wisdom. And then in verse 21, chapter 1, verse 21, he says, therefore, laying aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, receive with meekness the implanted word. So we have to pray and we have to study in order to know God's wisdom.
Right.
And so again, there's nothing mystical or magical about seeking this wisdom that is from above. James has already told us how to get it. So we've got to go to the right source.
Mm-hmm.
And then he shows this contrast between what life that is dominated by earthly wisdom versus life that is dominated by heavenly wisdom looks. So in verse 14, how does a life dominated by earthly wisdom, how does it look?
There's bitter jealousy, it's selfish, it's boastful, and there's everything that's false in it. You
Yeah,
know, and
yeah.
we post the truth.
So
Doesn't
go ahead.
well, what does that look like? Uh, what do those characteristics describe? You think? Well, today, right? It's all about me and what I want. And James has already told us we can't do it ourselves like you showed earlier. We have to go to the source of wisdom, and people don't want to go to the source.
That's exactly right. Does that life sound like a good life to you? A life full of bitter envy, self-seeking, and boasting? I mean, that doesn't sound like a good life at all. It sounds kind of miserable.
Right.
And so think about that. Here's somebody who wants to be a teacher because of the prestige it's going to bring him, but then he's full of envy and self-seeking and boasting. I mean, so it doesn't give what he wants from life. He doesn't want It doesn't give what he wants from teaching even. But then we contrast that and look at these great words in verse 17. What are some of those great words that wisdom from above brings us, gives us?
It's pure, peaceful, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Wow. If you want to be a good teacher, you're gonna have to have this wisdom from above, you know. In the context of teaching, pure, uh, peaceful, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, with slow learners, maybe. But and so this really fits well with the whole context.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. And, you know, I mean, those are beautiful words. And if we had more time, we could really just delve into what those words mean. But the words by themselves paint this picture for us of what it looks like. And I really appreciate that. And I just want to kind of leave it there. So you think about this. Look at the results. The earthly wisdom, he says it's demonic. In verse 16, it creates confusion in everything evil. So again, it doesn't give what people want. But on the contrast, this wisdom that is from above gives us a harvest of righteousness. And what a beautiful thought. So again, he's showing us. So I think when we get to when we look at 16 and 18, this is why he's telling us not many of us become teachers. If you're serious about being a teacher, and if you seek the wisdom that is from above, you can be a good teacher, and you can get something good out of it. You can get this harvest of righteousness. But if you don't, then you get confusion and everything evil. That's why we have to be careful about what kind of teacher we are. That's why we have to be careful in every situation about what our speech is saying about us, because what do you want? And what you want is this righteousness, this harvest of righteousness that only God can give us. And so we have to be careful. We have to be seeking the wisdom that is from above. And I think that's how it all ties together.
Well, thanks, Simon. We are out of time, a little bit past time. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Thank you for taking us through it, Simon. This is how y'all can contact us in the week. You can reach us at God's Answers to Your Questions or on our YouTube channel, CJ Marshall. If you have questions on James 3 or any other questions, we would be happy to talk about them next week or in our future shows. Thank you, Simon. God
Thank you,
bless
CJ. Have a good day. God bless you all.